Good morning today. Thank you for joining me. This is Sunday. It is September 13th. Man, where is the time going? A lot of you kids start school tomorrow, or at least a chunk of you do. Again, our prayers are with you as you head back to school. If you're a teacher or part of the staff, man, our prayers are with you as well as you head back to school. Thank you again for joining us. I'm Josh. This is Connect Church. I am glad that you give me the privilege of joining with you this morning in your home. Check us out on our website, which is found right below. If you've checked us out here, if you're joining us on Facebook and you haven't liked us, please do so. Please like us on Facebook. It'll allow us to see who you are and we can interact a little bit better with you while we're online. If you're joining us on YouTube, subscribe. You can catch all the videos that come out as we release them each Sunday. Good night. I hope you're doing well as we're heading into fall. I've got my fall flannel shirt on. It's been a little bit chillier here in Minnesota, and there is definitely that little tinge in the air. Fall is almost officially here, and we are feeling the effects of it. I invite you to join me every Wednesday night at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time on Zoom as we discuss whatever we've discussed here on Sunday morning. If you're interested in that, direct message us, call the church, check us out, send us a direct message or email, text, and we'd be happy to get you that Zoom link. And then tonight, 6 p.m. Central Standard Time, we are working through this book, The Third Option, Hope for a Racially Divided Nation. And maybe even a little bit more specific, we're looking at it, hope for a racially divided church. How can we come at this from a distinctively Christian viewpoint? And we look at that every Sunday night at 6 p.m. Again, if you're interested in that, drop us a line and we'd be happy to get you that Zoom link. Again, we mentioned this last week and an email went out, but we are, again, in the final stages of talks with Faith United Methodist Church about partnering with them and sharing facilities, sharing a building, and then whenever possible, joining our efforts together in ministry and outreach to our community. So that's coming up. So when we're able to meet together again in person, which hopefully is just weeks away now, we'll be doing that at Faith United Methodist Church. So a new location for us as Connect Church, and we're excited about that. We'll still be Connect Church. Faith will still be Faith Church. We're just sharing facilities and teaming up when we can. So more TBA to be announced. More information to come on that as that rolls in. We are building hope. We are building hope in Ezra. And we're looking at that. We're actually closing out Ezra today, and we'll be headed into Nehemiah next week. But we're closing out Ezra today. So let's see. These Old Testament stories still have a lot of application, a lot of meaning for us today. So let's jump in and see what Ezra has to say for us this morning.
Homer, you're crazy. Tell him this is all crazy.
Homer, I'd like you to remember Matthew 7:26. The foolish man who built his house on sand.
And you remember Matthew 21:17.
And he left them and went out of the city into Bethany, and he lodged there?
Yeah. Think about it.
For many years, unfortunately, and sadly and painfully, for many years leading up to the Civil War and through the Civil War, white Christians used the Bible to support slavery. Our section this morning, Ezra chapter 9, 10, and 11, this was a section of the Bible that was used by white Christians to support not only slavery, but to ban interracial dating and marriages. I think this is a gross misreading of Ezra, and we're going to see that here today. In just a moment, one prominent Christian university, if I gave the name, you would immediately know who that is or what that is. One prominent Christian university banned interracial dating up until the year. Anybody want to guess? Drop it in the comments. 2000. had banned interracial dating up until the year 2000. Upon announcing the repeal of that ban on interracial dating, the president of the school stated that this wasn't a hill worth dying upon. What were you doing on that hill to begin with, is my question. You know, we're going to look at this Ezra story this morning and see what is going on. What is God up to? What is Ezra up to? And what does that mean for us today? See, these Old Testament stories still have a lot of deep meaning and implications and applications for us today. We're going to see that Ezra's got some good things to say to us, and it has absolutely nothing to do with interracial dating or marriage. So let's jump in and see what Ezra actually is intending to say to us today. So last week we saw that Ezra the priest and scribe, same person, he was a priest and a scribe, arrived on the scene, arrived on Jerusalem, part of the second wave, led the second wave back to Jerusalem to teach the law or Torah. You're pretty much caught up. That's all the further we got last week. So if you've got your Bibles, look at Ezra chapter 9 this morning. It'll be up here. A major problem arises as soon as Ezra arrives to begin to teach the law. And let's look at what that is. Ezra chapter 9, verse 1. And I'm reading from the ESV, English Standard Version. After these things had been done, the officials approached me, that me is Ezra, and said, the people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the peoples of the lands with their abominations, from the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites. For they have taken some of their daughters to be wives for themselves and for their sons, so that the holy seed, not race, not a good translation, we'll talk about that in a second, has mixed itself with the peoples of the lands. And the faithlessness of the hand of the officials and the chief men have been foremost. All right. So what is going on? Well, the returned exiles and probably the first wave too have intermarried with the locals. Intermarried with the locals, with non-Israelites or non-Jews. What's at stake? Why is this such a big deal to Ezra? Well, let's skip over to verse 9. But now, for a brief moment, grace has been shown by the Lord our God to leave us a remnant, to give us a secure hold within his holy place, that God may brighten our eyes and grant us a little reviving in our slavery. Basically, God's grace is at stake. God has given the people a second chance. He sent them home. He's lavished his grace upon them and given them a second chance. And Ezra sees this as a threat. It is a threat. They are intermarrying with people they ought not to be intermarrying with. So, what exactly is going on? What exactly is going on here? Well, I want to be extremely clear, and it kind of began to come out in verse 2. This is not about race. That is not a good translation of verse 2. Some of the Bibles say holy race. Not good. That's not what it says. Holy seed. Holy seed is the much better translation. Not race. Race is a modern, we've been talking about this on Sunday, race is a modern notion, in the last 500-600 years or so. It wouldn't have been in here, okay? So it makes it sound like this is a racial issue. It is not. So as a shameless plug, join us at 6 p.m. on tonight, on Sunday nights. So what is happening here, this intermarrying is not a racial issue. They didn't care what people look like or their skin color. We don't want to read our modern race issues and racialization back into Scripture, which is kind of what we're doing. We're not doing that. We don't want to do that. The Hebrew people were not trying to protect their so-called race or the color of their skin. They didn't have some sort of Nazi ideology attempting to keep their bloodline pure. That's not what they were doing. What they were doing was attempting to keep their worship pure. They are attempting to keep their worship of God pure. And this comes directly from the law. Remember, Ezra's there to teach the law. It comes directly from the law. Deuteronomy 7, 1 through 4, 12, 29 through 31, and Exodus 34, 11 through 16. We're not going to read that, we don't have time, but you can look that up. Those 3 verses. God specifically said in the law, don't intermarry with the locals. Don't intermarry with the locals. Okay? So the Hebrew people, God gave them the instruction. God gave the Hebrew people the instructions not to intermarry with the locals, with people of other ethnic groups. Okay? Not race, but people with other ethnic groups. Not because they were from other ethnic groups per se, not because they were different, but because other ethnic groups worshiped other gods. And that was idolatry. The reason Ezra gets upset, the reason God gets upset, the reason God tells them not to intermarry with foreign groups or foreign people or other ethnic groups is because they would be led astray from a religious standpoint. This is a religious problem, not a racial problem. Okay? We see that over and over and over again, that it was perfectly acceptable if they wanted to marry a person with another ethnic group, if that other person switched teams. If that other person became Hebrew by adopting Torah, by adopting law, became Hebrew, which is entirely possible. If they became religiously Hebrew, ethnically Hebrew, they could do that. And God said, that's fine. We see Jesus's line, David's line, filled with people who were Gentiles, but kind of married in, who became Hebrew, became Jewish a little bit later. All right, so this is a religious issue, not a racial issue. What is at stake here for Ezra and these exiles is the very preservation of their God identity. Who were they as God's people? Okay, this isn't a racial identity. This was a religious identity. Who were they as God's people? So God was telling them, you are now my people. You have to be different, particularly in your worship and in your worship of your God, in your worship of me. Don't soak up the religions around you. Other religions and false gods will seep in unawares, particularly if you intermarry with people who worship false gods and other gods. So don't marry people who worship other gods. That's what's going on here. And so remember, this is a very small remnant of people returning these 2 waves. They're not a big group. Their very future is in question. 9, 8, and 9. Ezra realizes that your future is in question, and here you are. You've only been back, 80 years, 100 years, somewhere in there, and you're already repeating the same mistakes you made to get you kicked out of the land in the first place. You are repeating the same mistakes that got you exiled in the first place. You intermarried, you worshiped other gods, you were idolatrous, and God cast you out of the land. He brings you back because of his wonderful grace and mercy, and what do? You turn right around and begin worshiping other gods by intermarrying with people who worshiped other gods. What are you doing? That's what it's intermarrying. I'm like foaming at the mouth here. Intermarrying would compromise their true worship of God. So what's the response? What's a response? If you want to read it, check out 9:3, Ezra 9:3. Basically, I'll put it in 3 words. Ezra flips out. Ezra flips out. He responds that if he were the one doing the sinning, he pulls out his hair and he tears his clothes and he sits mourning in ashes. It's hilarious because he should have taken from Nehemiah, out of Nehemiah's book, which we're going to look at next week. See, Ezra pulled out his own hair, whereas Nehemiah pulls out the hair of other people. Maybe Ezra should have taken after Nehemiah and started ripping out hair of other people instead of his own. Anyway, kind of all humor aside, Ezra flips out because he sees the people are repeating the same mistakes, the same sins, the same errors that got him kicked out of the first place. Don't they take this seriously? Don't they take the worship of their God seriously? You have gotten a second chance. God has shown you his grace. What are you doing? Knock it off. Apparently, they haven't learned their lesson. So Ezra calls attention to this. And the people confess their sin. Verse 4 and following. The people, man, woman, and child confess their sin. They sit in a downpour. They're trembling because it's cold outside and because of their sin. The leaders stand up in front of their people, both guilty themselves and as a kind of a proxy for everybody else, the entire nation. You know, in our society here in America of ultra individualism, it's good for us to remember that God makes covenants with entire peoples. You know, not just me individually, with people groups. And the entire group here is held accountable for the sin of some. You know, this is a sin that some have committed, puts the entire group at risk of getting exiled again. And we do well to remember that as a church. We aren't just a bunch of individual Christians that happen to gather together once a week or however many times we gather, or the sum of just a bunch of individual parts. We are the body. We are one. We are both individuals and a body as one that answer to Jesus. This seems harsh. This seems harsh because Ezra flips out. He tells the people to put away their intermarriages and to get rid of all of that. Get rid of false gods. Get rid of your spouses that will lead you astray. It's harsh. We talked at length last week about grace. How is Ezra's actions grace-filled? How is God grace-filled? This seems anything but. Well, let's look. Grace is free. Grace is freely given. But grace comes with some strings. And before you get a knee-jerk reaction to that, let me explain what I mean by that. What I don't mean by grace comes with strings attached is that redemption or salvation comes with, or deliverance comes with grace and something else. Like it doesn't bring something else along with it. As we saw last week, grace is about God acting first. Grace is God's doing. It is not conditioned on us, on our actions and our belief. Nor do I mean that somehow God helps those who help themselves, or that, because grace destroys the notion that we are worthy, or that we can merit or earn God's grace or favor. Nor do I mean that grace can be repaid. There is no give and take with grace. Oftentimes we are reluctant to receive a gift from somebody because now I owe them one. That's not grace. We don't owe God one in the sense that we can somehow pay him back. Nor do I mean that grace somehow enters by the front door, as we talked about last week, passes through the house, sprinkles some pixie dust, and moves right out on the back door, and we see it out of the rearview mirror or something like that, and just leaves us to behave properly. Nor does grace save and then redeem and dump a whole bunch of rules in your lap like, hey, now that you're in, you can't marry foreigners, or now that you're in, you can't rob, lie, cheat, and steal. It doesn't dump a bunch of rules in your lap. What I mean by grace and strings attached is that grace demands a response. Grace demands a response. This is clear in Ezra. It's just as clear in Jesus' teachings, and it's just as clear as in Paul's teachings. The key is how grace asks or demands things. Grace doesn't dump rules or boundaries or regulations. Grace heads us in a direction, in the shape of a path, a race, or a journey. Grace says, this is the direction in which you shall now run, now that you are God's people or people of grace. See, strings attached, God's grace with strings attached points us in a certain direction. Grace, as we saw last week, doesn't set new rules and hard and fast boundaries of who's in and who's out. And you can look at that last week. But upon the direction in which one is headed, the strings attached are love. Love of God, love of neighbor. The string attached is love. Love of God, love of neighbor. Head in that direction. Head in the direction of loving God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. and head in the direction of loving your neighbor as yourself. See, grace creates a bond between giver and recipient, a covenant bond. There we are, covenant, with that word again. This is how Paul moves from grace to obedience, or how Ezra can move from grace to obedience, or how Jesus moves from grace to obedience, or how James moves from grace to obedience, because of what God has done for us in his grace and mercy in sending Jesus to die on the cross, or for the Israelites, for how God has delivered us again and sent us home. Here is now your response. Romans 8:1, there is no condemnation. He somehow can move from that to 8:12. You aren't debtors anymore to sin, but you now owe to the Spirit. You now live to the Spirit. You head in Spirit direction. For Ezra, he says, we move from God's gracious deliverance. He has brought us home from Babylon by his grace. The direction you now move is pure worship towards your God, which is avoiding becoming idolatrous by linking yourselves to people who worship false gods. Don't link yourselves with anything that may detour you or put you or head you in the wrong direction. So as people of grace, as Christians, what do we do with this? What do we do with this? Where do we go from Ezra? Is he telling us not to intermarry with foreigners? No, we talked about that already. What it does give us indication, the direction it does point us to, is to take seriously anything that threatens our allegiance to Jesus of Nazareth and compromise our worship of him and him alone. We're heading into the presidential elections. I would encourage you to take a deep and honest look at yourself. Is your politics, is the person you are going to vote for leading you in the wrong direction? Are you putting your allegiance somewhere besides Jesus of Nazareth? See, the common solution to this of heading in the right direction is just to erect more boundaries. We talked about that last week. Here's who's in, here's who's out. Look at these boundaries. Look at these rules. Let's make sure who's in and who's out. There are major problems with this, which we talked about last week. I'm not going to rehash, but I'll just add a couple of new things. If we focus on strict boundaries and who's in and who's out, those boundaries themselves become the focus. We see this over and over again in our short lifetimes as Christians. Christians begin to define themselves by what they do and what they don't do instead of people of the Spirit, instead of Jesus people. We define ourselves by what I go to church, I give, I read my Bible, or what I don't do. I don't cheat, I don't lie, I don't steal, I don't lie, cheat, and steal, and what is it? Don't drink, don't smoke, and don't chew, and I don't go with women who do. We define ourselves that way instead of being Spirit people, as Paul tells us to be. Let's just admit it too. Our boundaries will be constantly shifting anyway. Think about, how would you define a Christian even back in my lifetime, back in the 80s? How would you define a Christian today? It has changed. For example, when I was a kid, we had a camp that we would go to, our church camp, and we were not allowed to wear shorts at our church camp, even in the middle of July when it was like 300 degrees in the shade in an Iowa July. Now we can wear shorts on the campground. Did God change his mind in 40 years, 30 years? I don't think so. We focus too much on boundaries and not enough the direction in which we're heading. It becomes important then for churches to set and enforce boundaries then head in certain directions. Instead of pointing people to Jesus, we point people to boundaries, which are much more easy to regulate and to enforce. And we might try to enforce boundaries and set boundaries in order to keep our church pure or keep our faith pure. But it's rarely healthy for a church and usually isn't healthy for people. All you get is people who adhere to boundaries and rules but aren't headed in the right direction. Paul warns against this very thing in this letter to the Galatians. We're big about boundaries today, right? I don't have my mask. 6 foot, 6 foot, 6 foot away. We kind of do that in the church when we focus on boundaries. In 2 Corinthians 6:14, Paul writes, quit yoking yourself or stop yoking yourself with unbelievers. You know that? Did I say Romans? 2 Corinthians 6:14. 2 Corinthians 6:14. Stop yoking yourself with unbelievers. And see, as a teenager, I heard this kind of as a repeat of Ezra. Don't marry foreigners, unbelievers, people of different religions. And I say, see, Paul says the same thing. 2 Corinthians 6:14, don't marry or date a non-Christian. So I had that beat into me in youth group as a teenager. That may or may not be sound advice, and I think there is something to that, but I don't think that's what Paul had in mind. You know, see, first, in 2 Corinthians 6:14, Paul's advice is to the church, not to an individual Christian, not to who an individual Christian should date or not date, but the church. He talks about just a few verses later, the church is the temple as a whole, not as individuals, as a whole group, as a temple of God. This does have application for us as individuals, but the focus is on the church. It seems to be then that Paul is making a broad statement about who we link arms with as a church, who we form those deep relationships with. That don't link arms on a deep level and connect with people on a deep level who may divert your direction from Jesus of Nazareth, who might put you on a detour. Be wary of things and people who set you on a path that may get you lost, set you on a wandering in a path that deviates from the direction towards Jesus Christ. So Paul doesn't establish, I don't think he's establishing in 2 Corinthians 6, he's not rehashing Ezra, strict rules on who you can date or who you can marry, although it's important to consider that as a Christian. He's making the point that his people welcomed by God's grace, transformed by the Spirit, led continually in that direction by the Spirit, that we should ensure that people that we link arms with do not lead us into idolatry and away from Jesus Christ. I would say that's how we apply Ezra's message, and that's how Paul picks that up as well. See, grace points. When I tell my kid, don't point. Don't point. Monkeys point. Grace points. Grace points. Grace is found in Jesus, and it also at the same time points us continually to Jesus. Grace rallies God's people around Jesus Christ and continually points us towards Him. Instead of fiddling with strict boundaries and rules on who's in and who's out, grace just simply says, head that way. Follow the Spirit. Head towards Jesus. Move towards Him. Grace moves us towards Jesus. This grace says there's your target or goal. Move towards Him. My challenge to you this morning, this week, is to let grace free you to move towards Jesus of Nazareth. Grace isn't there to put down strict boundaries and to get us to focus on boundaries. It's there to free us to live according to the Spirit and to move in the direction of Jesus Christ. May grace take your mind, if you're obsessed with boundaries and who's in and who's out and rules, may grace take your eyes, your mind off of that and lift it towards the Savior. Grace enables us to be fully human, filled by the Spirit. Be the people that God created us to be, freed of guilt and shame, free to be alive in the Spirit, continually moving towards Jesus of Nazareth. May this be a message of hope as we build hope this week. If you need more information or would like further conversation about that, check us out on our website. Upper right-hand corner, Connect Now button. It'll just lead you through some steps, and we'll be in contact. Let grace free you and move you towards Jesus of Nazareth in the Spirit. Many blessings. I will see some of you here shortly for our outdoor gathering. Hopefully I'll see the rest of you throughout this week. many blessings. May the Spirit fill you and empower you this week to live grace